Hello, Internet. Welcome to another Wednesday serial. I've been building to this one for months, actually. Um, in my great X-Men read through, I read a healthy chunk of Uncanny X-Men, and then I hit this point where there are so many crossovers with other titles, in particular X-Men. Um, I decided I wanted to start moving to another title, and then I would cycle to X-Men eventually and then come back to Uncanny, which is probably over a year from now. But I've spent the last over a month going through Wolverine, which I had started because the initial few issues of Wolverine were Claremont, and I was intent on finishing my Claremont run, sans Excalibur. Now, I had read that, and then I read a little bit more of Wolverine because I was very taken, and I had done a video in my sense of the term not too long ago, covering a number of things, in particular covering Mary Jo Duffy and a few other people. I mean, like Peter David had done Wolverine for a short while, and I thought it was really compelling and really interesting, but I held right before what I'm going to talk about today, the Larry Hama run. The reason I did that is because the Larry Hama run is basically just short of 100 issues. And I felt like that was a good breaking point to come back to. And I did. And now I'm here. Now I am in it. And so I want to talk to you a bit about what I remember and maybe some parts in some ways that I don't, and go through this run. Um, Before kind of showing covers and talking about more specifics, I want to talk more about the overall bit because I took some time and looked up what are kind of the more remembered Wolverine runs. Because I feel like for certain characters, there's some more obvious stuff up front that you hear people talk about more. Batman, you have Year One, The Dark Knight Returns, Hush. Um, if I Had My Druthers, Year Two, and then a few others as you dig a little deeper. There's certain ones people will bring up more. Spider-Man, you have Craven's Last Hunt, you have Coming Home, you have like the first Sinister Six, the death of some woman, uh, you know, all the Spider-Man greats. But when it came to Wolverine, the ones I knew about going in that were bigger were Enemy of the State, which is something I enjoy, despite it offhandedly killing one of my favorite lesser known Marvel characters in a panel, which sucks. Which is continuity they held to, which they shouldn't have. Hornet lives, damn it. Never mind. So there's that one. And then the Claremont Frank Miller mini, of course. Um, but not too many others. As I dug in, I've heard about some others. One run follows the Larry Hama run immediately thereafter. Warren Ellis is not dead yet. Curious to get there. And then there's some other stuff, primarily in the second volume of Wolverine, that people really like. But by and large, volume one of Wolverine that runs for, I think, slightly over 150 issues plus annuals, not super fondly remembered for the character, which is odd. Um, Before the Larry Hama stuff, I feel that's all really good and is worth picking up in collections or whatever. But once we get to the Larry Hama run, it's clear Larry Hama's a fan of Wolverine and everything that came before. It's clear he has a penchant for the world that Wolverine lives in, but he doesn't seem to have any big ideas or grand designs. So it is baffling to me that he got 100 issues with the character. And so I think from here it makes sense to kind of dig in. So his first issue is Wolverine 31. And I believe a good marker for especially these longer runs is to honestly see if the first issue of a long run like this isn't even necessarily a huge collector's item, but if it's kind of a in the know, slightly more expensive comic. And this one is not. This one you could probably find in a quarter bin somewhere sometime. Um, it features new characters, I guess. The first appearance of Daikumo and Goro, which not memorable characters. But what we're seeing is Hama starting to play with more of the Japanese background, but not relying necessarily immediately on the characters from Japan. Some of the smaller ones. It's an interesting way to start, and these are fun issues as Wolverine fights the Yakuza. It's a opening story. I don't think it's as strong as what immediately came before, but it's fine. Um, and then we have this one off, the Devil in the Dark, which is another Wolverine fights a beast story in the woods. We seem to get one of these every few years with Wolverine in one form or another. It's a natural fit for the character, I understand, but they tend to be pretty rote. Wolverine deals with the bestial nature via proxy of some werewolfish character and fights them in the woods and protects them for humanity, but has a solemn problem with having to kill the animal because in the end it's just following its nature, whereas the people are maybe the real villains. I've seen the story told 5 times. Um, it's an oldie but a goodie, I guess. And then we move to Larry Hama kind of kicking it up, and this is something we'll see where a lot of his better stories are playing off the threads of what came before with Wolverine. So we have Lady Deathstrike and Puck. Puck's a goofy addition. This is the beginning of Blood and Claws, which is considered one of his better ones by fans. I don't think it stands out that much. And I'd actually point to some other issues as we go here. And that's something I want to point out. There are other runs I've talked about and certainly gone through before. Daniel Way on Deadpool. Nick the Jerk on Spider-Man. I hate those runs, and I think the writers did a terrible job. By and large, I don't think Larry Hama does a terrible job. He does a very serviceable job. There's a few stinker issues in this basically 100 issue run to be expected. But by and large, they're serviceable, but a little slow, a little boring at times. And I think that's the bigger problem. But not here. This is fine. This has some fun. Wolverine with guns and stuff, blood and claws. And then we wrap up with the Lady Deathstrike fight, and this has some heartbreak for Wolverine as he moves forward. And then one thing that I've always remembered about Wolverine that's actually from Runaways is um, the character describing himself as a globetrotter, not a local, which is something he goes to before enlisting the help of Spider-Man, which was interesting. But here we move to this bit with him being in Japan, then kind of being in the woods and whatnot, and now he's in Venice. And so he's kind of this like Larry Hama's painting him more as this mountain man that's very worldly and mostly worldly just because he's thrown himself into these situations and figured it out as he goes. It's interesting that he relies so much on this idea of the character when what preceded Larry Hama on this run of Wolverine, which is the first time to really make the character work, Claremont knew to build the character up, he had to give him more dimension. And so we see Wolverine outsmarting the Hulk and using the Hulk to meet his ends without necessarily lifting a finger, and playing things very differently as Patch to give the character more depth, because Claremont was saying, like, if I need to give this character legs to maintain an ongoing series on his own without the X-Men, I need to set it apart. I need to make it different, where he's been kind of the muscle in that book. And need to give him different ways to approach things so that things could build. And Larry Hama is not doing that at all. He's not tearing anything down, and he will get there. He uses a lot of what Claremont built there, but not in the ways of understanding the finer motions of what was going on. We'll see that even when he's pulling off of the older Wolverine stuff built from Uncanny or the original Wolverine minis, is he misses the subtext. He misses the cultural notes of what are going on, and really focuses on like the fight and sometimes the deeper lore. But it's like someone who's really read the book and really understands the book, but doesn't understand anything the book was pulling from or what it's going for. It's kind of surreal at times. Um, we'll see a lot of Storm pop up throughout Wolverine, comparatively to other characters. And we have an introduction here. This little girl is not a little girl. She turns out to be a cyborg. And that is a big plot thread that goes through. So, yes, so LCD and Albert, who is the cybernetic Wolverine replica, are two of the big additions Larry Hama makes to Wolverine's villain pool, which is somewhat infuriating because Albert's kind of obvious, but also never really a threat, because Wolverine can just kind of slash him up and is a better fighter. And Albert gets his licks in, to be sure, but he's never a saber tooth or a Lady Deathstrike or anything, nor is he ever as compelling. And then LCD is a cybernetic android, but effectively a little girl, and talks like they write it so her vowels are all on. So it's like, "Hey, Mister, how's it going?" Which is painful to read. And she's a character that keeps coming up, and I think it's a big contributing problem to why um, this run isn't as strong as it could have been. And then we move to something that I think is interesting. I think Wolverine was at its best when it was very much an X-Men B book. But one other trick it pulled a few times was here, where here's Cable, Sabretooth, and Wolverine. Like, this is a big in. And what's really interesting here as this story continues to the next issue is that Wolverine and Cable don't particularly like each other. They met each other in Cable Mini before, and they're both kind of the gruff characters of their books, the elder statesmen, and they don't like each other. Too similar, I guess, or whatever. But they're working together, and they know they're basically on the same team. But Wolverine questions Cable's methods, which is funny because Wolverine was the character of whose methods you were supposed to question for a long time. And so it was interesting to see the play of pointing out, like, Cable is not Wolverine, Wolverine is not Cable, because I know in the background, especially at the time, they were considered to be very similar characters, and by butting them up against each other and seeing how they were dealing with a major threat like Sabretooth, it really did a lot of work for both characters and their relative books. So that's interesting. We have 43 here, which was some forgettable story. I don't know. And then we have a quick break with 44, where Wolverine tackles this undersea monster while on a cruise and protects these old ladies. This is a break. This is Peter David coming in, who I'm guessing this was a filler story that they had on file from when Peter David was doing the book right before Larry Hama took over or something. But this is a wild divergence. It's not particularly great. This is very much just another Wolverine comic, but it really shows how much was going in, how much creativity. And it didn't feel like a Wolverine comic necessarily as much as a kooky idea for a sea monster Cthulhu-esque idea Peter David had, and he just threw it in with a Wolverine story to sit around that eventually came out. And then we jump back to Larry Hama, and he's relying on, let's see here, featuring Sabretooth, Lady Deathstrike, and the Hunter from the Darkness. And so he's trying to play in some of the mythos he built, but another werewolf character doesn't really compare. And he's trying to build this idea of the Hunter, but I wouldn't say it fully connects. And then we have another filler issue, but this one is dealing with Wolverine in the city. I actually think this is a decent, more or less single issue. Um, it doesn't necessarily build much, but I think it shows Wolverine being a hero without needing to rely on his personal involvement as much. And then we get a sequel to um, the Weapon X stuff from Marvel Presents. And I think it kind of speaks to the fact that this is not necessarily collected with that story moving forward, really. And so, yeah, it's called Shiva, it's part 2, and then it wraps up in 50. And what we do is we get a lot of play with this new, what's supposed to be big villain in Shiva, and it doesn't connect. So here's the cover to 50, die cut. Isn't that pretty? Which leads directly into another three-parter, which is something Larry Hama does a lot, is have three-parters. I think it's supposed to be a shorthand for beginning, middle, and end to help him kind of lean on a crutch to help write these things, which, given where he's at, didn't connect much. But we have another bit. We have Spiral come in, who is supposed to be a bigger villain at the time, and it ends up with Mojo and Wolverine fighting the whole Mojo world kind of thing, which is interesting because it was a little out of his depth to be tackling on his own and made interesting, and then was followed up by one of my favorite issues of his run, and very similar to that Cable bit I talked about just a little while ago, where Wolverine is dealing with Shatterstar, and Shatterstar doesn't know who Wolverine is at first. Once he puts two and two together, splays his sword and says basically like, "It is an honor to meet you." And it showed kind of these characters next to each other and how different they were. I think this is a standout. And then we get a fun little bit with Gambit, Jubilee, and Sunfire going back to Japan. And this isn't the first time Jubilee showed up, but it's the first time she's there and really sticks around for a while as a side character in this book. And she really is part of the cast once we get to this point. Like, she's popped in now, but once we get here, it's a big deal. It's on sale twice a month, and Jubilee's part of it. And we're hitting the era now where the cartoon would have been out, and so we're getting some media synergy or whatever. So, yeah. And then we get arguably the biggest moment Larry Hama adds to canon in the end of this three-parter in 57, where Wolverine, after all this fight, Rico is killed by Wolverine's hand. And that has ramifications that last beyond Larry Hama's run. Initially, it's a big deal and kind of the thing Wolverine's struggling with for a while. But It's actually handled pretty well, and it's a death that I think is held a lot better than a lot of other deaths in superhero comics. She wasn't such a big character; they had to bring her back necessarily, but it it left an impact without necessarily having to be reversed, so far as I know. But there's a lot of Wolverine left for me to read, which leads into some of the more goofy stuff Hama does in his run. Um, First, there's a two-parter that fill in with this guy here who's a ghoulish monster guy. This is supposed to be like a Halloween sort of issue, in which, in order to get by, Wolverine has to go in disguise, so he shaves himself down. And this is a weird two-parter, but it's fun and actually has a lot. And again, the divergence from Hama just kind of show that Hama's doing an okay job, but almost anyone they could bring on could do an okay job with Wolverine. He's a decent enough character. It's about building the side cast and the villains and a bigger through line that's going to make a longer run sing. And we just never get there here. Moving forward, we get the Hand and Shiva and Sabretooth back in the mix. I said Shiva doesn't. I mean, Shiva continues for a while because after all this buildup, but I mean, not a character that really sticks around for super long. 61. Another fight. Oh no, Wolverine and Sabretooth are fighting again. I don't necessarily think much was here. And then we get more of Wolverine's past as this stuff continues. Yeah. And then we go back to another one of Wolverine's past loves in Silver Fox that we learn about in this issue. 65, we talk about Wolverine's past with Silver Fox, which is a story that's introduced before Larry Hama comes on, but it's this Native American woman that Logan fell in love with. And their big thing is they had their names carved together in this little wood cabin they had out in the wilderness that they were living in before Sabretooth came and killed her, ruined their lives, and all that. And this is following the death of Mariko to show how just tragic Wolverine is. And it's not a bad issue, but it's a little goofy. We have part 2 here following up. And then we move to just Wolverine fighting it out, being more angry than usual. And then dealing with Omega Red, who I believe was supposed to be kind of a big Wolverine villain, but just kind of ended up being in the general X-villain pool. It's actually not used all that often. And then we get a painful backdoor pilot in a way. It's to the Savage Land with Soren, which means Khazar shows up eventually. And this is just preceding Khazar new series that's going to happen. So this is to try to get people's interest up for that. Didn't make me any more interested. There's a fun issue with an old damaged Sentinel from some past fight that they had. This is, again, I believe, a standout issue comparatively to a number of others. And oh yeah, noted. The one thing I didn't like about a lot of this era of comics is they had a lot of these insert things. So like, there's a trading card thing in here, and to like flip around and move around that was more distracting than I would have liked. Not that it's a big deal. There's kind of some filler, some good Sentinel Jubilee stuff in here. Yeah, sorry. So 74 is actually a weird standout issue for Larry Hama for the good and the bad, along with the two issues prior, which deal primarily with Jubilee, which I think was really strong to try to build up essentially a side character for the book. Um, so what's interesting about it is, so when we're introduced to Jubilee way back with Claremont, she's kind of just this orphan mall rat. As we go on, we learn that her parents were killed supposedly in this car crash. What Larry Hama wants to add is that her parents weren't killed in the car crash, they were murdered, and it was a cover up to deal with, why they were put away. And so Jubilee's had her suspicions, and now they're confirmed, which in of itself should have been a three-part story. Would have been good to actually go through the motions and tell that story clean. Instead, those suspicions are founded because while fighting the Sentinel, Jubilee dips into like a time vortex, sees the murder happen, and dips out. Meanwhile, Wolverine and Jubilee have to deal with the Sentinel onslaught, kind of relating to the Master Mold. Or not the Master Mold, but a handful of Sentinels that are rogue, that are trying to overtake the planet because they've overridden their programming that will keep them from killing humans. So they want to eradicate all life on Earth so things are peaceful and orderly. Standard sci-fi plot, but is just a part of this. So that's happening, and Jubilee is able to thwart them by, when Wolverine and Jubilee are fighting them, there's one Sentinel of the like five that are knocked down, and Jubilee has the ability to take it out, but refuses to because she doesn't want to effectively kill an opponent that's already defeated, and is instead working on dismantling the time thing that's going to cause the sci-fi nonsense to happen. From this, the robots see and learn empathy and disregard their plot and say that they have a lot to learn, and then basically grant them like a wish. And so Jubilee's wish is to go back and go and deal with the killers of her parents. But once she gets there, she basically knocks them on their ass, gives them a stern talking to. Even though the cops are already on their way, they don't show up. And then Wolverine is there with her, and she's like, why? Why wasn't I strong enough to kill them? And Wolverine's like, no, you're stronger for not. And it's that strength that saved the world today. Which is like, it's like a smart idea, but it's so hammy it doesn't land. And like, it's like there's like two good potentially stories here that are fighting for each other. And I wish some of the meh of previous issues went away so that we could have had 6 decent issues here, and in particular 3 issues that really would have built up Jubilee. Instead, we don't get that. We get this weird hodgepodge of stuff, which I felt like these 3 issues. So again, 72, 73, and 74 of Wolverine were a weird mix of high and lows, and were like the ultimate Larry Hama story. So, yeah. And then you jump right to 75, which is ramifications from X-Men 25 when all the adamantium gets ripped out of Wolverine. And then here, you basically see him deal with the fever dream that happens, and he saves Jean Grey. And it's weird that the big moment for Wolverine actually happens in X-Men and not this book, but whatever, Ming. That happens, and then the ramifications of having his adamantium come out basically follow us through the rest of Larry Hama's run until it magically doesn't matter anymore. And then things start to churn. 76 has Lady Deathstrike. Does that seem derivative at this point? I believe that's actually the point, is we're having Wolverine with his bone claws fighting the villain that is most recognizable, that he's fought the most throughout the Larry Hama run. But she takes pity on him in a way because he's not the same anymore. He's kind of broken. And that weight kind of carries. And so we get that continuation. And then we have some mooks fighting Wolverine in the snow. I don't know. It's not much. And then we see something that was a big deal for me that I didn't understand and doesn't necessarily follow through. In Wolverine 79, we get the first appearance of Zoe Cauldron. What's significant about that? Well, way back before Larry Hama had Wolverine, there is the introduction of Landu, Lockman, and Lake, which is this kind of originally mystical, but is slowly being turned into more of a sci-fi agency that's floating around Marvel, but really has only interacted with Wolverine at this point. At this point, like way back in the past and easy to forget. And then now, barely in this issue, and they're going to come up again and again. And the agent that we deal with primarily is Zoe Cauldron. Now, she's going to have some play with Wolverine. But as we move forward, eventually she puts Wolverine to a path that's going to have him intersect with Apocalypse. We'll get there. It's not great. And then she's in the book a little more. And then basically out of nowhere, she leaves and she's dealing with Deadpool and becomes a major deal in Joe Kelly's Deadpool. Much better written, much more interesting. I didn't know she was in this run and originated here. So this character that had all this significance for me from one of my favorite runs from forever ago, I didn't know had origins here. And that was big for me. And then to realize how little she's written and what little an impact she makes despite floating in this book for about 25 issues is crazy. It was just kind of odd. And then we get a build up of trying to get us a new Wolverine villain from, again, the Marvel Comics Presents stuff in Cyber coming back. And Cyber is interesting because he's really just arch. He's just kind of a villain for villain's sake, which is kind of like Sabretooth, but there's not as much personal stuff there. He's just a jerk. So, yeah, that fight continues. And then with 82, we start seeing something kind of interesting. Now that Andy Kubert's on the book, and has been for a while, but we get more of these gorgeous covers, which is a big step up for the book, even though it's just the covers. We're fighting the Yakuza, we're fighting the Hand, there's Rebar. And then around here, and for a little while longer, we see Larry Hama kind of start to wrap up his moment with Wolverine, even though he has more time with the book left. So those characters I was talking about earlier, the little girl cybernetic and this cybernetic guy, and then Bloodscream, who is a villain that predates Larry Hama but is kind of back from the past, forgotten, all kind of start intersect and have been following Wolverine for a while. And they continue to do so, but as they're going, Hama's kind of cutting off what he's put into the book and kind of putting a bow on a number of things. We take a quick break for the Phalanx crossover, which leads into Generation X. And also a moment to have with Forge and the Native Americans, which was interesting. And then we move to the fact that Bo has been tied, and now we're going to really lean heavy into Wolverine being the X-Men B book for a while. So there's a bit more with Gambit in this issue, and fighting and following a different thing. This is also another issue separating Wolverine from Gambit, but this is also a slight follow-up to a 4-issue mini that they just had, which I should read. Then we have a big deal. This is the first time Wolverine and Deadpool fight. So this is actually, I believe, the most expensive issue of Larry Hama's run. And then we get a wrap up to kind of the story that was following us through those moments, where Wolverine's trying to find someone from the past, and there's another Claw Boy and Sabretooth. And then in 90, I think it's interesting that we have this big fight between Sabretooth and Wolverine. It's been a while. It feels big. But it's just another fight between these guys. And what's interesting about the end of the fight here, this is when Sabretooth was being held at the Xavier Mansion. And the issue ends with Wolverine killing Sabretooth. But the whole issue's been a touch surreal. So it doesn't necessarily feel like it actually happened necessarily. And then the next month is the Age of Apocalypse crossover. So technically this book wasn't around for a few months after. And then when we come back, it's an issue just dealing with the ramifications of that. And we're seeing the characters kind of cross paths, because it really gets heightened here that since the adamantium's been pulled out of Wolverine, he's becoming more feral and literally more bestial. And Sabretooth, right after having this impromptu lobotomy, starts becoming kinder and nicer, and some of the X-Men, in particular Boom Boom, starts warming to him. And it's interesting to see how much Boom Boom warms to Sabretooth when Jubilee's not there, but her presence is very acutely missed and mentioned. It's one of the stronger points of the run. And then we kind of continue with the movement of things, kind of a filler issue. And then we get this Juggernaut issue where there's a fight with the Juggernaut. But this is weird because this is serving much more as an XB book, because this takes the Juggernaut from where he was, where he loses the fight with Onslaught, to here, to going into the Wolverine Malibu universe and fighting this group of exiles, which is outside the Marvel universe. Technically, it was some weird thing Marvel was trying for a hot minute and then went away. And then we get a play on that absence of Jubilee being felt, where Wolverine goes and starts training Generation X, some of what he knows, but they're not liking Wolverine too much, but Jubilee's really trying to stand out for him. But his bestial side coming out more is what's really causing the tension, and Jubilee can sense some of that, but she's still there for Wolverine, but the team isn't. It's a very interesting play. And then we get a push to Guardian and Wolverine reconnecting. And this is playing on the idea that these guys are old, great friends, which is canon at this point, but hasn't been leaned on too much, since Wolverine intersected with Alpha Flight at times, but it wasn't as much actually part of the comics. Then we move forward, and then we get kind of the X-Men status quo at the time. So it's Wolverine and Storm, and then Cannonball and Kelbian are kind of on this hiking trip and kind of dealing with the nature side of things. This is actually a slow, interesting issue, and again, I think a standout. Whew. And then at 97, we begin the climb to 100. Wolverine fights this BDSM lady. I don't know. And the fight continues, honestly. And then we have these characters that are tied to Apocalypse, kind of pushing Wolverine to a different place. Zoe Cauldron helps push Wolverine into this odd place that's technically out of time. I believe that's one of Apocalypse's lairs. And then in 100, the big deal is that they're going to rebond Wolverine's adamantium to him, and then it gets rejected, and all the villains get dealt with by having these adamantium shards just lacerate them to death. And Wolverine is now not just more bestial and feral, but he looks like a Neanderthal with more bone claws, and he becomes more grotesque. And this is something that carries for about a dozen issues, and then slowly, first by like different artists being on the book, and then just somehow just fades away. And we'll talk more about that in our last little chunk here. So I believe this new chunk starts intelligently by bringing in the X-Men, and then you have Jean Grey and Scott reacting to Wolverine's changes. We have Wolverine carrying forward, and we see him just kind of out on the prowl dealing with these changes, but he's different, and his inner monologue and dialogue is less. He's more bestial, which is interesting, but doesn't make for a great point of view character. And then we get one of the weirdest moves where Elektra becomes the main side character of the book, where Stick has said she needs to help Wolverine get back on the path. And so we have this weird connection now between Wolverine and Daredevil, which is doubly weird because I don't remember Daredevil and Wolverine ever meeting outside of later in like the New Avengers, like in passing, but I don't even think they have a big moment. So I don't know. And then we get stuff kind of waylaid for a while. Elektra's there, but they're dealing with Onslaught and all that. And in that, actually, this issue barely has anything to do with Onslaught. It's actually interesting with Stick running into Wolverine as Wolverine saving some kids from a fire, and firefighters are like him, even though he looks bizarre. The continuation of Wolverine and Elektra working with him continues. We have a handful of these great black, white, and red covers. They go to Greece. Wolverine meets Elektra's family, and then they go fight the Hand because, of course, they need to. And then it ends in some nonsense, and then we carry forward. So, yeah. We then move to Tom DeFalco taking over for an issue where Wolverine teams up with Shaman from Alpha Flight. This one seems a bit stronger. I don't know, but also kind of marked the end of this weird caveman-like Wolverine existing, and it just kind of went away, and he went back to wearing his normal costume instead of like the weird wraparound bandana thing. He fights some spirit after meeting up with the X-Men. This is actually mostly a slower issue where he's dealing with the X-Men again. I like the slower part. The dumb fight shoved in doesn't do much. And then he goes to live in an apartment on his own, and this killer mime attacks him, but it's not really the mime. The mime is someone from the city, and there's this malevolent spirit going around possessing people. And then Storm and Jean Grey show up, and they all have a fight. And then it wraps up with Lady Deathstrike getting involved in this whole kerfuffle, and then Wolverine leaves his slumlord apartment that he's been in for 2 days, and that whole thing is dropped, even though it felt like they were trying to put Wolverine in the city to be the hero of some no-name neighborhood. Very odd. And then we get to the last chunk, and it's so unceremonious, so abrupt, because we've had all that happen. So we've been with Larry Hama, despite a few fill-ins, for a decade now. And then we get to Operation Zero Tolerance. And these issues are just part of Operation Zero Tolerance. This is X-Men B-Book complete. Like, this is just issues in the event story. And if you're not reading the entire event, these make no sense on their own. And then the last issue of Larry Hama's Wolverine is an issue of Zero Tolerance. The biggest thing that happens in this comic is Cyclops gets a bomb planted in him. It's barely about Wolverine at all. And honestly, after all this, I'm curious to see what everyone else does next. I hear it's one of the better Wolverine stories, as mentioned, but God, I wish there was one more Larry Hama Wolverine issue here as a coda. Goodbye. Jesus, like, he is, I still think to this day has the longest run on Wolverine. But for what? Why? Why was he on this book so long? It makes no sense. There is no, and here's the thing. I understand it's not like now where these writers come up and they have 100-issue plan. And I'm not saying that should have been at all. But like, there should have been bigger arcs and bigger builds, and like, you're staying with these characters for so long, there should have been more build and grandiose, and it just comes and goes, and what a nothing burger. So I don't know. I'm looking forward actually to reading more Wolverine though, and like I said, none of this was, well, not none, and there's a few issues, but this wasn't terrible. There was some fun stuff in here, some kooky ideas, but nothing feels bigger or grander than the stuff that came before. And from what I understand, it gets bigger and grander once he leaves. So I went through all that glut for that, and this video is a glut, I know. So there you go. There you go. The glut of Larry Hama's Wolverine.